You grew up being told you're the most anxious, most sensitive, most mentally fragile generation in history, and somewhere along the way, part of you started to believe them. But here's what they never told you. You're not anxious because you're weak. You're anxious because your brain was handed to a machine that spent years figuring out exactly how to break it, and nobody asked your permission. This isn't a defense of your generation, it's an explanation. And those are very different things. Every generation gets labeled. Boomers were called selfish, Gen X was called disaffected, millennials were called entitled, and you got soft, snowflake, too online, too sensitive, too much. But here's the thing about labels. They always describe the symptom and never the cause. And if you understand the cause, everything about your psychology starts to make a different kind of sense. Picture this. It's 2012. You're 12 years old, maybe 13. Someone hands you a rectangle of glass and tells you the whole world is inside it. And it is. Your friends are there, the funniest videos you've ever seen, the most beautiful people you've ever looked at. And also a system, invisible, tireless, enormously intelligent, that has one single goal: to keep you looking. Not to make you happy, not to connect you, just to keep you looking. That machine is learning you in real time, every pause, every rewatch, every moment of hesitation, building a model of exactly what makes you feel something. And you're 12, and your brain is still being built, and you have no idea any of this is happening. Here's the first thing you need to understand. Your dopamine system was rewired during the exact window it was supposed to form. The adolescent brain is a construction site. Between roughly 10 and 25, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, impulse control, and long-term thinking, is still being assembled. During that window, the brain is unusually sensitive to reward signals. That sensitivity is how young brains learn what matters. But what happens when the reward signals are engineered? Social media platforms in 2010, 2011, 2012 were already running thousands of simultaneous experiments on user behavior. Not accidentally addictive, deliberately optimized. The like button, the infinite scroll, the notification that arrives exactly when you've put the phone down. These were designed by teams of engineers whose entire job was to find the precise stimulus that would make your brain produce dopamine and want more. Your generation was handed that system at 11, 12, 13 years old, right in the middle of the construction zone. And the result isn't weakness, it's structural. Researchers who study adolescent brain development have found measurable differences in attention, impulse regulation, and baseline anxiety in people who had heavy smartphone use during early adolescence. You didn't choose this, you were handed a tool, and the tool had a hidden function. Here's the second thing. You grew up in permanent ambient grief. Every generation inherits the anxiety of its era. Boomers grew up under nuclear shadow. Millennials had September 11 in their adolescence and the 2008 collapse in early adulthood. Gen Z got something different. Not one catastrophic event, but a continuous low-frequency hum of multiple catastrophes running simultaneously. Climate anxiety that told you the planet might be uninhabitable in your lifetime. A pandemic that shut down the exact years, 15, 16, 17, when identity is supposed to form through risk-taking, social connection, and the careful construction of who you are outside your parents' house. Economic conditions that made the milestones your parents used as benchmarks, a house, a stable career, a financial foundation, feel not delayed, but structurally impossible. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety, grief about a future that hasn't happened yet but feels inevitable. And carrying that weight while also being in school, while your brain is still developing, while your entire social life is happening through a screen, that's not a soft generation. That's an extraordinarily heavy load carried very quietly. Here's the third thing, and this is the one that almost nobody gives you credit for. You developed emotional fluency that no previous generation has ever had. Gen Z, the generation labeled most fragile, is also the most emotionally literate generation ever studied. You have more words for internal states than any generation before you. You can distinguish between anxious and overwhelmed, between sad and dissociated, between irritated and overstimulated, between lonely and just tired. Most people twice your age don't have that vocabulary at all. Psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett calls this emotional granularity, and her research is clear. People with more words for emotional states are better at regulating them, more resilient under stress, and more accurate in understanding themselves and others. The irony is almost beautiful. The generation told it can't handle its emotions has developed the most sophisticated emotional vocabulary in recorded history. But here's what nobody talks about. Knowing the name of what you're feeling and knowing how to move through it are not the same thing. Gen Z has the language. What it sometimes lacks is the experience of sitting with discomfort long enough to come out the other side. When every uncomfortable feeling can be instantly interrupted by a scroll, a reel, a notification, a text, the nervous system never quite learns that it can survive discomfort without escaping it. And that matters, because life will eventually produce feelings that can't be scrolled past. When that happens, the vocabulary alone isn't always enough. This isn't an indictment, it's an honest observation. The same system that made you anxious also made it very hard to practice tolerating anxiety. Those are different problems, but they share the same cause. Here's the bigger picture. Gen Z is not a broken generation. Gen Z is the first generation to experience something that will eventually everyone, the wholesale algorithmic restructuring of human attention, human identity, and human connection. You're not fragile, you're early. You felt the damage first because you arrived first, and some of you have already started building something different. Deliberately offline relationships, intentional media use, a fluent suspicion of performance that older generations are only now beginning to develop. But here's the uncomfortable truth that lives underneath all of this. The same hyper-awareness that makes your generation remarkable also makes it harder to just exist. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from understanding your psychology too well, from being able to name the manipulation, see the system, identify the pattern, and still feel it working on you anyway. Knowing you're being marketed to doesn't make you immune to marketing. Knowing you're anxious doesn't make the anxiety stop. Sometimes the insight is a gift, and sometimes it's just another thing to carry. Learning to be okay with full clarity, to let experience happen without immediately analyzing it, might be one of the most quietly radical things your generation could do. You were not handed an easy world to grow up in. You were handed unprecedented tools with unprecedented consequences during the most neurologically vulnerable years of your life inside an economic and ecological context that would test any generation's resilience. And you're still here, still building language for things nobody has named, still questioning systems most people just accepted, still looking for something real in a world designed to give you something stimulating instead. That's not fragility. That's the beginning of something your generation is still figuring out how to call itself. But you'll name it. That's kind of what you do. If this explains something you felt but never been able to articulate, subscribe. And if you want to go deeper, click the next video. It's the psychology of people who grew up too fast. More of you will recognize yourselves in it than you'd expect.